Another licensed game on NES Works? Oh, please.
You know all about dirty laundry, don't you?
Wow, 1989 really was a banner year for bad NES cartridges based on Christopher Lloyd movies. Where's a big old vat of turpentine, acetone, and benzene to dissolve those ROMs when you need it? Oh, don't get me wrong, Who Framed Roger Rabbit for NES is nowhere near as bad as Back to the Future, but this certainly doesn't belong on some universal list of top 300 NES games ever or anything. No offense to you if you received this game as an 8-year-old who loved Roger Rabbit and spent months decrypting its mysteries. This is another one of those messy, unenjoyable games that nevertheless has a lot of interesting ideas behind it, and which I could certainly see young players imprinting on at an impressionable age. There are worse things than developing a love for video games based on a sludgy effort to create a point-and-click graphical adventure. I'd rather play this than ALF or King's Quest for Master System. If it weren't for the imminent arrival of a certain other adventure game on NES, I'd call this the best attempt at doing a straight riff on the Sierra Lucasfilm format available on American consoles at the time. Alas, Roger Rabbit, it's a sad thing your adventures have ended here. That is to say that, unlike Back to the Future for NES, Roger Rabbit for NES feels redolent of the LJN of yore. Not a good game, one that shipped unsatisfying and incompletely formed, but certainly one filled with ambition and maybe even a little bit of invention. Kinda okay, but needed more time in the oven is certainly not the greatest crime a video game can commit, and this speaks again to Rare's unique place among Western NES devs, as I touched on last episode. Although Who Framed Roger Rabbit is not a good game, it fails in a big, enthusiastic way. Rather than settling for a callow action game, Rare's designers keyed in on the film's murder mystery premise and turned the NES game into something resembling a murder mystery investigation. Roger Rabbit Renzoku Satsujin Jiken this ain't, but you certainly get the impression that the designers had Sierra adventures in their rearview mirror while zipping through 8-bit Toontown, Benny the Cab style. Or maybe that's designer instead of designers? A quick check reveals that Kevin Bayliss appears to be the only known non-musical name attached to the game, which could explain why the game feels so underformed. This is a lot of game for even a tiny team to pull together. It feels a lot like some of the more ambitious multimodal action-adventure games we've seen Japanese studios pull together for media licenses. Think Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode or The Goonies 2. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is not a game that lives up to those standards, I'm afraid, but it certainly does more justice to the source material than Back to the Future did. Low bar, I know. Okay, it's more like what if ALF for Master System were tolerable and well-intentioned. Again, to expand on something I touched on last episode, Rare was simply built differently from other Western studios who made games for NES. Again, the NES's European and Australian contract studios like Rare, Beam, and Ocean hailed from the primal fires of 8-bit microcomputer development. But Rare bailed on that world around the time it changed its name from Ultimate Play the Game to Rare and began min-maxing their NES skills. So they missed out on a lot of the trends in computer game design that became prevalent in Europe in the late 80s, one of which was a particular approach to multimodal gameplay. Both Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit involve mode switching during the course of the action, but they each take a very different approach to it. A lot of movie adaptations that hit microcomputers in this period consisted of different film scenes and events interpreted as standalone game sequences, each with distinct controls and goals, strung together sequentially without any real connective ligament between them. Complete one scenario and a new one would begin, requiring you to quickly scramble to adapt to a totally different interface and objective. It's not like that approach didn't show up in Japanese-developed games too, but it was considerably more pervasive in European releases. Generally though, multimodal games from Japan took pains to produce a sense of context by embedding one format within the other. If you compare Back to the Future and Roger Rabbit, you can see that I'm making a pretty fine distinction here, but it's a meaningful one. Back to the Future mostly consisted of those repetitive on-foot scenes, with the minigame events popping up at the end of each level and forcing you to engage with a totally different style of play perfectly on your first try in order to advance. In Roger Rabbit, the two play formats flow freely into one another, establishing a sense of connectedness between its modes that, had Rare been given more time and budget to refine, could have resulted in a grand, holistic experience. Who Framed Roger Rabbit never quite gels, but that primarily seems to be a side effect of that trademark LJN austerity. There's some good stuff here, but it's stretched incredibly thin across a framework far too large for the amount of actual content the game contains, so it feels both incredibly repetitive and, unfortunately, unpolished. Still, props to Rare for giving it a go. After all, this could have been a far more simplistic game, as we've seen with the other Roger Rabbit game for NES to have dropped in 1989. I am referring, of course, to the cartridge that we in America know as the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, a sort of hybrid action puzzler that lands somewhere between Lode Runner and Sokoban. Kind of. Crazy Castle had debuted on Famicom Disk System under the title Roger Rabbit. But it didn't really have much of anything to do with the film beyond the character sprites, which is why Kemco could so effortlessly reskin that series to feature something like half a dozen other film and TV properties over the years. This Roger Rabbit, on the other hand, feels like a game that you couldn't easily retool as another property. It's a more faithful and more interesting take on the movie. I don't know that it's more fun than Kemco's creation, but you can't deny Rare gave it an earnest go. Who Framed Roger Rabbit puts players in control of booze-soaked private investigator Eddie Valiant, who finds himself shackled to his client, cartoon superstar Roger Rabbit. Roger has been accused of murdering Hollywood mogul Marvin Acme, and you need to uncover evidence of Roger's innocence, while incidentally putting a stop to the mad schemes of evil capitalist Judge Doom. The game takes place across both 1940s Hollywood and its nearby cartoon ghetto, Toontown, each one presented as top-down maps that players can freely traverse and explore. Exploration takes the form of adventure scenes where you control Eddie as Roger tags along, Minnie Mouse style, under computer control. You might detect tasting notes of Ghostbusters here, or perhaps a piquant bouquet of Spy vs. Spy, especially in the way that you need to search the scenery and occasionally punch the crap out of other characters by switching Eddie's current inventory holding icon to fists. The prospect of facing actual violence and death in a graphical adventure game like this was nothing new, but it feels a lot less annoying and unfair here than in something like King's Quest, since you always have direct console-style control over Eddie rather than controlling him indirectly with points and clicks. And Rare does at least try to make it clever, allowing you to escape danger most of the time with gags and jokes. Judge Doom's weasel thugs constantly pursue you on the world map, and if they catch up with you, they'll rough up Roger. But you can help him escape by telling jokes, selecting the funniest answer for each joke from a set of punchlines that you accumulate throughout the game, which sends the weasels into paroxysms of laughter, allowing you to beat a hasty retreat. Other thematically appropriate elements appear as well, with familiar locations appearing on the world map, such as Eddie's office and the head office of Acme Studios. You can drive around on the map in Benny the Cab to make good time, and you need to work your way past deadly hazards with humor, such as giving a baby rattle to a snake, making it a rattlesnake, so that it won't attack you. It's gently humorous stuff. So it's a shame that it badly overstays its welcome. The rattlesnake bit is pretty much the one puzzle gag that appears in the game, and it keeps showing up. Likewise, you can chat with the other characters you encounter in adventure scenes, but they rarely have anything of value to say, mostly just letting you know that you should search the current building, which you'd have to do anyway. Since there's no real signposting in the world map, you have to enter one repetitive building after another and search for objects, avoiding the same little obstacles that are amusing the first time and tedious the 20th. There is a lot of exploration here, but most of it feels like busy work, and it never quite gels. Worse, your pursuers are relentless, which makes orienteering tough, and the interior spaces in each area, Hollywood, Toontown, underground passages, are mostly identical, which certainly doesn't help you get your bearings. Even Toontown doesn't really live up to its namesake, looking basically like a more garish version of Hollywood with slightly rounded architecture. It's even populated by humans. Toontown, the bizarre cartoon ghetto that humans never visit. I realize I'm getting nitpicky here, but it does speak to an underlying issue with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is mainly to say that creating a truly good and satisfying video game adaptation of this movie seems like maybe a genuine impossibility. Why, just look to Kemco's take on the movie. Released as Roger Rabbit on Disk System, Bugs Bunny on NES, and Mickey Mouse on Game Boy in Japan, that one cartridge manages to combine all the corporate cohorts that appeared together in the film. But for video games, they had to be divided up and separated by region and platform. Those three characters and properties do not all appear in the same game at the same time. One has to imagine that the licensing costs and restrictions required to make that happen on NES would have been prohibitively expensive, even if we weren't dealing with a legendarily stingy publisher like LJN. A truly great Roger Rabbit game would need to have Roger and Eddie interact with Mickey Mouse and Goofy and Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. A Lucasfilm-style adventure where Daffy and Donald square off in gorgeously drawn piano bars as you move between quests and scenarios inspired by the film. Roger Rabbit remains a singular work in Hollywood history for the way it somehow manages to bring beloved cartoon characters owned by rival studios together into a single whole. This wasn't some kind of Fortnite-style dumping ground that threw together familiar character skins into a formless slurry, but a meaningful neutral ground that brought together some of the most popular cartoon characters of the early 20th century into a world where they lived and thrived and interacted with one another. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the movie, is an absolute technical, creative, and licensing tour de force. It's a movie that really only could have happened when it did in 1988. Sorry folks, but I'm about to digress into a lengthy sidetrack about a cinematic masterpiece, but let's be honest, if any movie of 1988 deserves it, it's Who Framed Roger Rabbit. That or Die Hard, but we'll get there in due time. Roger Rabbit feels almost like a referendum on a dying age of Hollywood and the animation industry. It arrived about a year before Walt Disney debuted The Little Mermaid, which almost single-handedly turned around the flagging fortunes of that company's animation division, and which Disney would follow up on by making computer animation a core component of its cartoons. But Who Framed Roger Rabbit does not use computer graphics in order to create its seamless world where humans and cartoons exist side by side in one another's spaces. Instead, the animation crew working on the film made use of every trick in the analog book in order to pull off its incredible visual illusions. Then they went ahead and invented new tricks that helped keep its blended realities grounded and well clear of the uncanny valley. The animators and stage crews paid meticulous attention to things like light sourcing and physical interactions, so that when Eddie shoves Roger into his trousers, or Roger hits his head against a hanging lamp, or smashes ceramic plates over his head, your eye never questions the illusion. It's a truly staggering work of pre-digital animation, packed with technical flexes that never distract, but ultimately just serve to heighten the movie's sense of reality. Who Framed Roger Rabbit stands in bleak contrast to Disney's modern live-action versions of its classic cartoons, note the air quotes around live action, which use computer tech to crush the boundaries between live and animated material, as well as the material itself, into a murky gray gruel. Roger Rabbit, by contrast, bursts with color and light and movement, a celebration of a bygone age that was just about to become truly bygone when Pixar reinvented the cartoon biz a few years later. And it probably never would have happened without the success of Back to the Future. Roger Rabbit was, in fact, Back to the Future director Robert Zemeckis' follow-up project. Zemeckis brought along Christopher Lloyd to play the villainous Judge Doom, as well as Back to the Future bit part player Charles Fleischer to voice Roger himself. But perhaps more importantly, he brought along his newfound clout and that of his producer, Steven Spielberg, who was in the midst of a hot streak and had become one of the most powerful creatives in Hollywood history. Spielberg and Zemeckis grabbed the rights to Gary K. Wolfe's 1981 detective noir satire called Who Censored Roger Rabbit?, a novel that the film loosely resembles. A surrealistic noir story, Who Censored Roger Rabbit revolved around a detective hired by a comic strip character to investigate his own death. Wolfe combined hard-boiled detective cliches with a dry Douglas Adams-like sense of sarcasm that helped smooth over the wild disparity between the novel's pulp hero and the fact that he lived and worked in a world where comic strip characters lived and spoke in word balloons. The screenwriters reworked the movie into a piece about living cartoons, if only because the notion of characters who spoke entirely through physical printed word balloons wouldn't have played that well on the screen. But Spielberg and Zemeckis cashed in some chips in order to pull in real cartoon characters from the golden age of Hollywood. Not just Bugs and Mickey, but Betty Boop and Lena Hyena, too. A year or two later, and they probably wouldn't have been able to convince the newly revitalized Disney into allowing Mickey and Donald to share screen time with Bugs and Daffy. But for the moment, Spielberg was the most powerful guy at Disney, whose Touchstone imprint distributed the movie, and he managed to swing it. I guess in the age of Smash Brothers and Fortnite, it's hard to convey what a big damn deal this was at the time. These were icons of the screen, decades-long rivals, and suddenly they were here, together, playing back up to a brand new character. As if Mario and Sonic's first team-up wasn't Mario and Sonic at the Olympics, but instead as bit players and Astrobot. But packing every frame of the film with recognizable characters wasn't just some desperate Ready Player One style bid to make the audiences love the movie. Please, here's a thing you recognize, I beg of you to applaud. No, it really helped sell the entire premise of the movie. Watching so many recognizable characters wander around, drawn in their own distinct style, yet rendered with the same consistent shading and lighting as their peers, each as solid and real as the other. And arriving in 1988, Who Framed Roger Rabbit enjoyed an extra bit of authenticity that would be impossible to recreate today. Many of these characters' original voice talent were still alive at the time and read their respective characters' lines. Not just Mel Blanc and Jim Cummings, but even Mae Questel reprising Betty Boop one last time. The entire movie works on so many levels, as a comedy, as a legitimate noir murder mystery, as a love letter to classic Hollywood, as the ultimate exercise in analog animation chicanery, and as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked technological progress. After all, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a film about boomer nostalgia too. A look back not only at the golden age of Hollywood and all the cartoon shorts that multiple generations grew up watching at the matinee, but also the politics and culture of the mid-century era. Roger Rabbit is about funny cartoon guys embroiled in crimes, yes, but it's also about the dismantling of the American civic transportation infrastructure in favor of the rugged individualism of the automobile, which would soon allow Americans to avoid sharing space with their fellow citizens for a short train ride across town in favor of sitting in traffic for an hour each day on the freeway. Now, the evil Judge Doom hates tunes, apparently, but the real motive behind his actions boils down to making money. He intends to sell Toontown and the local private rail lines for demolition in order to clear the way for freeways, transforming Los Angeles into a concrete hellscape of interchanges and traffic jams, just like the real world we know today. But in Who Framed Roger Rabbit's alternate reality, Doom is thwarted when Roger uncovers Marvin Acme's will, which cedes Toontown to the Toons. One assumes that Roger's LA is a nicer place to visit, less riddled with gridlock and pollution on I-5, and also occasionally strafed by Dumbo in search of a peanut. Of course, the NES game contains none of this, or satisfying gameplay for that matter, but I still can't hate this game. Rare swung for the fences here, despite the fact that LJN surely gave them only a fraction of the time and budget required to make a great game. Unsurprisingly, Who Framed Roger Rabbit for NES didn't work out, but you can certainly see the outlines of a classic 8-bit adventure game here in another reality where LJN had Nintendo timelines and funding for its releases. It could have been so much worse, as we saw last episode. I said a while back that there are two versions of Rare on NES. The Passion Project company, working on things like RC Pro-Am and Wizards and Warriors, and the company in Pay the Bills mode, responsible for things like WWF WrestleMania. But I suppose I need to revise that statement to encompass a third Rare, the company that tried to create passion projects in order to pay the bills. Without success, of course, but there's such a thing as a noble failure. Next time on NES Works, Vanna White has a vowel movement.